Hi, my name is Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Now, in February, I'm going to try doing something a little bit different. So, rather than doing a normal wrap-up at the end of the month, I'm going to film reviews as I go along through the month. And what I should end up with is like a vlog style video at the end of the month. So my reason for doing that is that I have a terrible memory. So when at the end of the month I'm trying to review books that I read 4 or 5 weeks ago, I really struggle to remember any great detail about those books. Even if I've read a book like last week, I struggle to remember that much about it. Which is due in part to the medication that I take. One of the side effects is that it does cause memory problems. So, I mean, I'm kind of used to it now. It's quite annoying, but that's life. So what I am hoping to achieve with this is that if I do my reviews as we go through the month, hopefully I'll be able to give you a more sort of comprehensive summary of what the book is about, and also my sort of immediate thoughts on having read the book. So the first book that I read in February, today is the 3rd of February, and last night I finished Fight Club by Chuck Paluhniuk. So this is my first time reading this author. I have not seen the movie Fight Club. However, before reading this book, I was aware of the twist, which I'm not going to say what that twist is in case you are the one person in the world who does not know the twist of Fight Club. Although I was talking to my girlfriend last night and it turns out she is the one person in the world who does not know the twist of Fight Club, and she edits my videos, so therefore I will not be giving any spoilers. So what's this about? So we follow an unnamed narrator who has a fairly mundane existence, a job he doesn't enjoy. He suffers from insomnia, and when he goes to his doctor, who is not terribly helpful, his doctor says something along the lines of, well, at least you're not as bad as that lot in the church. And in this church, they have, every evening during the week, they have a different support group for people with a different illness or disease. So, for example, one evening it might be like a cancer support group, for example. And so what our narrator does is he starts attending these support groups, even though he does not have these illnesses that the other people in the group have. He's pretending. He says this is because when people believe he is dying, they are more likely to listen to him, they will pay him more attention. When he is in the support group, he meets someone called Marla, and they clock each other as fakes, like straight away. They're both there sort of under false pretenses, if you like. The other character in this book is Tyler, who I think our narrator meets him maybe in like a bar one night or something. Tyler and Marla meet and develop a relationship, quite a tumultuous relationship. Tyler is the founder of Fight Club. So Fight Club is a club where men go to fight. There's nothing personal about it. You don't necessarily know the person that you're fighting. It's just a fight, and then there's no consequences, no repercussions. It's an underground club. The first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. The second rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. There are 8 rules, and they're not all the same rule. There are other rules. So you might, when you're out and about during the day, you might clock someone who you have fought or recognise from Fight Club, but you won't acknowledge to each other how you know each other. So our narrator, through Tyler, becomes involved in this underground fight club. So this is a fairly short book, so I won't go too much more into the plot. What we see is how Fight Club evolves, how the stakes become raised when Fight Club is no longer meeting the needs of those men. I really, really like this book. So, to start with, so going into it, I was slightly apprehensive as to how certain things would be portrayed, how things would play out, because obviously I was aware of some of the plot of this book. But saying that, I didn't know how it was going to go, I didn't know how it was going to end. As I went through reading the book, I started to like it more and more, and by the time I got to the end of it, I was actually quite moved by the end of the book, which I was really not expecting at all. There's quite a moving scene right at the end. So I was quite surprised by my reaction to this. I wasn't expecting it. I found it quite thought-provoking in many ways. I would definitely recommend it. I'd be interested, I think, to see the film, to see what that's like. But this is a really, really great book. I would be keen to read more by this author as well. He's got quite a unique, sort of unusual style, I would say. So this is a great start to the month. Hello, it is the 9th of February and I've got a few books to talk about. So first of all, I read Something Special, which is a short story by Iris Murdoch. This is a tiny little book. This is about 40 pages long. Apparently it's the only short story that Iris Murdoch ever wrote for publication, and it was previously unpublished except in a 1950s anthology and in Japan. So this is about a young woman living in Dublin, and we see her reflecting on her life and her relationships. I won't say too much because it is a short story, but I thought it was very enjoyable. Next, I want to talk about the Twyford Code by Janice Hallett. So Janice Hallett wrote The Appeal, which was had a lot of buzz last year, which I enjoyed. The Appeal is a murder mystery told through a series of emails. The Twyford Code is told through a series of voice messages on a mobile phone that's been found. I've actually DNF'd this. I read just under half and just got quite bored. The central premise is quite interesting. So it's about a series of children's books which allegedly may contain some sort of secret code. So the main character who has recorded these voice messages on the phone is trying to investigate this and figure out what the code is and what it could mean and so on. And which, you know, is the kind of thing I would normally really like, but I just got kind of bored, and I found it quite annoying the way it's told. It's like transcripts, and there's an explanation at the start that says that some things they're written as they sound. So for example, must have is written as mustard, but like must have doesn't even sound like mustard, so I don't know why that is, and it's just I found it quite annoying, and I didn't really care enough to finish it. But a book that I did finish yesterday is Destination Unknown by Agatha Christie. So this is a standalone, and it's a thriller rather than a classic sort of Christie murder mystery. This is a thriller. I have read this before. I wasn't sure when I picked it up from the library whether I had, but I definitely have. I couldn't remember like how it was going to pan out, but what was happening was definitely familiar to me. So this is about what's happening is these scientists are going missing in mysterious circumstances, and the police enlist the help of this woman who goes undercover. So she agrees to help because she's depressed and suicidal, and so the police basically say to her, well, do you want to help us on this mission? There's a chance you might die, but you're suicidal anyway, so like that's okay. It kind of makes more sense in the book, but that's basically what happens. So she goes undercover and she like impersonates the wife of one of these scientists who has disappeared, and then we see she becomes embroiled in this adventure. I enjoyed this. It was very, very readable. I prefer like the classic murder mystery as opposed to this sort of thriller, but it was still a very enjoyable read. It's the 12th of February, and a couple of days ago I finished reading The Membranes by Ta-Wei. This is a novel that was first published in Taiwan in 1995, and this edition was translated by Ari and Larissa Heinrich, and this English translation was only published last year. So I read this for Gen the Librarian's LGBTQ books in translation read along. This is described on the back of the book as a classic of queer speculative fiction. It's a sci-fi novel. I don't read a lot of sci-fi. I really enjoyed it. So I won't say too much because it is quite a short book, but we follow our main character Momo, who is a young woman who, it's set in the future, and in the future, for environmental reasons, people live in these domes under the sea. And we follow Momo's life. She works as a dermal care technician. Momo is quite a loner. We find out about her life, how she feels she fits into society. We hear about her quite difficult relationship with her mother, who she's estranged from. Because this was written in the 90s, it's interesting to see from a 90s viewpoint in terms of technological and scientific advancements, sort of the things that we had then and how the authors imagined how that might go in the future. Also interesting from an environmental point of view to see in terms of how the authors imagined how certain environmental concerns will play out in the future as well. So that's quite interesting. It's hard to talk too much about the plot without giving spoilers, but I really love the central premise of this book. I thought was really fascinating. It says on the back of the book that it explores the bounds of gender, memory, self and reality, and it does all those things. There were a couple of very small aspects of the book which I wasn't entirely sure. I think maybe I didn't quite get. They just seemed a little bit odd to me, but that was like a very minor quibble. Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think this is a book that I'll definitely be thinking about in future. It's a book which I will definitely reread in future. I would highly recommend it. It does make me want to as well, like, pick up more sci-fi. It's not a genre I read a lot from, but I really like books that sort of make me think and question things, and this book really did that. It's the 15th of February. I am wearing a Christmas jumper because it's cold. And yesterday I finished another book, Give Me Your Hand by Megan Abbott. So I picked this up because even though I am reading a number of other books at the moment, which is unusual for me to be reading more than one book at a time, I just wanted a book that was going to be easy to read, pacey, engaging, and this delivered. So this is a psychological thriller. Our main character is called Kit, and she works as a scientist in a laboratory. When she was a teenager, she was good friends with another girl called Diane, and they have since then sort of drifted apart. They're no longer in touch. But when they were teenagers, Diane disclosed to Kit her deepest, darkest secret. So part of the book is told in flashbacks, and then part of the book is told in the present day. In the present day, Kit's one of the scientists working in this laboratory, and Diane comes to work in the laboratory. She is also a scientist, and obviously Kit knows this deep dark secret about Diane. The scientists are all competing with each other to be chosen to participate in this research program into PMDD, which is premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So we see them all sort of quietly competing with each other to be chosen for this sort of prestigious research project. I enjoyed the book. It took me maybe about a day to read it. I'd say it's probably not one of my favourite books by Megan Abbott. I have read a few by her, only because it didn't quite pack as much of a punch as I ideally like in my thrillers, but it was still a very enjoyable read. It's the 17th of February and I've got a few more updates. So I've just finished the other day reading this collection of short stories. This is the Penguin Book of Japanese Short Stories. I've been reading this for about a month or so. I think this is a good sort of all-round short story collection. I particularly like the way that this These stories are categorised by theme. So the themes that we have in this book are Japan and the West, loyal warriors, men and women, nature and memory, modern life and other nonsense, dread, and disasters, natural and man-made. So one of my favourite stories was a book called Filling Up with Sugar, which is by Sawanishi Uton, translated by J. Rubin. And this story, it's in the dread section, of course, and it's about a woman whose mother has this disease whereby parts of her body slowly turn into sugar. The disease is called systemic saccharification syndrome. And I did have to Google it to check if it was a real disease or not. It's not a real disease, of course, it's not a real disease. But it was so convincing in the story. And then the other one that I particularly liked is actually the final story in the collection, which is called Same as Always by Sato Yuya, translated by Rachel Denito. And that story is in the natural disaster section, and it's about the aftermath of a nuclear fallout and the impact that has on a woman and her family. And it is not what you would expect at all, and it's very, very dark. But I think this is an all-round, like, good, solid short story collection. Okay, the next book that I've only just finished is The Bell by Iris Murdoch. So I'm not going to say too much about this because I wasn't overly keen on it. This is my third Iris Murdoch novel that I've read. And I am keen to read more by her, but this I felt quite underwhelmed by. I've had a look on reviews online and a lot of people really love it. So I'm obviously missing something. It's kind of about a woman called Dora who goes with her husband, who's quite an unlikable character, to live in this community. But then it kind of veers off, and a large portion of the book is not really about Dora, it's about some of the other characters in this community and like the secrets they have and stuff, and it just didn't really work for me. I found it quite dull. It kind of came together by the end. The end was a bit more interesting, I will say. But for me, it was not one of my favourites. Okay, I want to mention a DNF. I don't routinely talk about DNFs, but I thought I'd mention this one because it is a recent release. It's a book which a lot of people have spoken about, and it's a book which I imagine almost certainly will be longlisted for this year's Booker Prize. And that is To Paradise by Hanya Yanagihara. So I read about half of this and decided to DNF it. So, to put this into context, I have read Yanagihara's two previous novels. So I read The People in the Trees, which I liked some aspects of, but I wasn't overly keen on. And I read A Little Life, which I liked a lot. I thought was very, very good. So, To Paradise is, it's kind of three books in one. So the first book is set in 1893, the second is set in 1993, and the third is set in the future in 2093. So in each of the books we have different characters, but people have the same name. And so the books, I guess, are kind of linked thematically rather than directly through characters. The first section of the book is set in 1893, and it's set in an alternate version of America. Our main character is a young man who lives in what's called the Free State. So the Free States is New York and the surrounding areas, and his family want to arrange a marriage for him with another man who he's not terribly enamoured with. He's got his eye on someone else. So it's interesting because of the alternate history point of view. In the Free States, same-sex marriage is legal. I thought that first part was fine, quite interesting. I didn't love it, but it was fine. The second part is set in 1993, and it started off all right, but then a large section of the second book is told in the format of a letter from one character to another, and for me it just felt like a lot of info dumping, which I got bored with. So I can see why it's necessary, because even though this is a long book, because it's like 3 books smushed into one, there isn't actually that much space for the author to show you the world they've created for you as the reader to sort of naturally come to find out about the background of how we've got to where we are in the book. So it felt quite info dumping to me, and I didn't really like it. So what I did, something which I've like never done before, I skipped forward about 50 pages to book 3, because obviously I knew that the 3 books are quite distinct. Book 3 is set in the future, and I thought that sounds like the most interesting part to me, so I skipped forward. And part 3 started off quite interesting. So it's set in the future. There's been a series of pandemics, but then it veered off into this, like, again, more letter formats between characters whose name I knew from other sections, but obviously they're not the same people, and I just got confused and decided that I didn't really care enough to carry on. So, yeah, I mean, people do speak quite highly. I've heard mixed things about it. Some people really love it, and I can't really say one way or the other because I haven't finished it. But from what I've heard other people say about it, I don't feel like I personally am missing out by not finishing the book, if that makes sense. I think it's probably just not for me. And I feel like I kind of would have rather just have a whole book set in the future and looking at that aspect of things rather than mushing everything together. But that's just my personal opinion. And then the final book I want to talk about today is my first 5-star read of 2022, which is very exciting. And it's a book which most people have already read and everyone already loves, and I'm very late to this party. And that is Detransition Baby by Torrey Peters. So I thought I was going to like this, but I think I underestimated how much I was going to like this book and how good it really is. This was longlisted for last year's Women's Prize, and I can't believe this didn't make the shortlist because it's so good. It's incredible. It's a remarkable book, and I would even go as far as to say that, so Piranesi won last year's Women's Prize, and I love Piranesi, but this, for me, gives it a run for its money. It's so good. So this is a book about womanhood, and largely about trans womanhood. We have 3 main characters. So we have Ames, who is living as a man, but previously lived as a trans woman, Amy. And we see why Ames chose to detransition back to living as a man, not because he is not a woman, really, but because of how he is treated living as a trans woman. And we find out that from the blurbs, that's not a spoiler. So the book goes into why Ames has made that decision. Ames, in the book, uses he, him pronouns, so that's why I'm using that to talk about him, but it's complicated. So Ames has been in a relationship, sort of fling type thing, with his boss, Katrina, who is divorced. She is a straight cis woman. And she becomes pregnant by Ames. So Ames thought that he was infertile because of the hormones that he took when he was living as a trans woman and because of the testosterone blockers and so on. But turns out he's not infertile because he's got Katrina pregnant. So then we see them trying to figure out what they're gonna do. Katrina, I think, wants to be a mother but is unsure about her relationship with Ames and what that is and what that could be. Ames, I think, wants to be a parent but not a father, because that would just sort of increase his dysphoria. And Ames feels like if him and Katrina raise this child together, Katrina will be the mother and Ames will sort of inevitably become the father, and that's not what Ames wants. So Ames suggests that they bring Reese into the mix. So Reese is a trans woman, and Ames used to go out with Reese when Ames was Amy. So Reese and Amy were in a lesbian relationship. Ames knows that Reese wants to be a mother, and Ames thinks that if Reese comes into this sort of 3-way relationship, that it will mean he's less likely to be forced into being the father figure, if you like. The book has quite almost a light-hearted, humorous tone, but it's coupled with the real gravity and seriousness of what's discussed in here and some of what happens in the book. Some of it's really quite dark. For me, the tone, it's just so well balanced. I think Torrey Peters gets it just right. I think the writing is exceptional. I think on a sentence by sentence level, it's so well crafted. I think it's remarkable. Throughout the book, we get sections which are told in the past. So when Reese and Amy were a couple, and we see their relationship, and we see the reasons why that didn't work out. For me, one of the most sort of interesting parts of the book was Ames's character in terms of his reasons for choosing to detransition and how he feels like he needs to dissociate from his body in order to survive. And it's really heartbreaking, actually, in many, many ways. But I'm saying that, but overall, I feel like it's quite a joyful novel. Like, there is a lot of dark stuff in here, but I think it's quite hopeful, and there is joy that comes out in the book, which I really appreciated. I think it's fabulous. I think it's great. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend that you pick it up. I mean, you've probably already read this book. Everyone has already read this book. But it's so good. And I can't believe it's taken me this long to read it. But I absolutely love it. Total 5 stars, no question about it. Loved it so much. It's the 21st of February and I have a couple of updates. So yesterday I finished reading Out by Natsuo Kirino. This is a Japanese crime novel, first published in the 90s, and it was translated into English by Stephen Snyder. So I think this is probably one of the best known Japanese crime novels. It's described as an international bestseller. I've heard several people talk about it and rate it really quite highly. So it's about, and we know this from the start and from the synopsis, a woman who kills her husband, and her colleagues at the factory where she works help her to cover up the crime. So it's not a whodunit, it's a case of are the police going to catch them and find out what's happened. It's quite a long novel, it's just over 500 pages long. For the first 3/4 or so, I was quite enjoying it. It was fairly pacey, quite engaging, quite enjoyable. It was fine, I was having a nice time. And then I got to the final sort of quarter-ish of the book and it went quite drastically downhill. So, there is sexual violence in this book. Not just towards the end, but earlier on as well. And the way that violence is portrayed, I think, is incredibly problematic. And when it first happened, I wasn't sure, because you're not quite sure, because you're inside the mind of like the baddie, if you like. So you know, to a certain extent, you maybe let it go. But by the end of the book, this certain portrayal kept happening, and I just think I can't believe like how well renowned this book is, bearing in mind how it talks about sexual violence, and I hated it. I wish I had not wasted my time on it. I don't recommend it. I gave it 1 star and I think it's trash, so yeah, don't read it. On a more positive note, however, yesterday I read Trust by Domenico Starnone. This is an Italian novel translated by Jumper Lahiri. It's quite short, it's like less than 200 pages, so I got through it in a few hours and I quite liked it. So This is about a couple called Pietro and Teresa, and they decide one day that they're going to share with the other one their deepest, darkest secret, so something that they've never told anybody else. The idea being that they think by doing so it will somehow sort of bind them more closely together. And obviously, inevitably what happens is not long after doing so, they break up. So they go their separate ways. And we then follow Pietro and we see him get married, have a family, etc., etc. But he does have sort of like intermittent contact still with Teresa, and he feels like the shadow of what Teresa knows about him is just hanging over him every day. He's, you know, obviously he doesn't want his family, his work or anyone to know this thing that Teresa knows about him that nobody else does. It's quite an introspective novel. None of the characters are particularly likeable, which I tend to enjoy reading in a book. The writing and or the translation was really very, very good, and it was interesting because there's an afterword, certainly in this edition, by the translator, and she talks about the process of translation, which I find really interesting anyway, and in particular how in the original Italian text there are certain words and phrases which are repeated, and her choices as a translator as to how she translated that into English, I found really, really interesting. So yeah, this was a good little read. I enjoyed it. I'd quite like to read something else by this author. If you like sort of unlikable characters, introspection, something a little bit different, give it a go. Okay, so it's the 28th of February and I've got two final books to wrap up. The first of those is The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. So I really like this. I didn't know anything about Louise Erdrich before going into this book. She's an Indigenous American author, and most of the main characters in the book are also Indigenous Americans. Our main character is called Tuki, and she, right at the start of the book, we see how she has been imprisoned and then released, and then she goes to work in this bookstore. So the bookstore is actually based on a real life bookstore, which apparently the author Louise Erdrich actually owns, which is kind of cool. This is described as a wickedly funny ghost story, and I would say that there is certainly a humour running through the story, but I would call it more serious in tone overall rather than funny. The ghost story comes in because Tuki is being haunted when she's working in the bookstore by one of their most regular customers called Flora, who's died. And Flora seems to be haunting in particular Tuki, and Tuki is trying to figure out why this might be. So although it is a ghost story because there is a ghost in there, it's not your typical sort of scary horror type of ghost story. There's a lot about Indigenous culture and history in the book, which I found really interesting because it's not something I know a lot about at all. Real life events are woven throughout the story in a really interesting way. There's some serious issues discussed in here, racism, prejudice, police brutality. I found that I lost my way with it a little bit towards the end, and that's really just because I found how things wrap up and come together a little bit confusing, but I think that is like to do with me rather than a fault of the book. But yeah, so I did find it a little bit confusing towards the end, but overall, you know, I really liked it. I think it's a really good book, really interesting, quite unique. It's quite hard, I would say, to define genre wise as well, but no, it's a good read. And the final book that I read in February was The Reading List by Sara Nisha Adams. This is a delightful book. So we have two main characters, one called Mukesh, who is a widower. His wife died a couple of years previously, and his wife was a big reader and he has never been a big reader, but he wants to start reading, largely to connect with his granddaughter, who's really into reading. So he goes to the local library, which is under threat from closure, and there he meets a librarian called Alicia. Now Alicia is only working in the library as like a summer job. It's not something she wants to do in the long term. She herself admits that she doesn't even really like books. She discovers this reading list, which is a list of 8 books, 8 sort of well-known books. She doesn't know where this list has come from, but she starts reading her way through these books, and that's how she starts to get into reading. Mukesh, when he comes to the library, asks for a recommendation, and she, not knowing anything about books and not being a reader herself, she recommends to him the books from this list as she's reading through them. We see Alicia's home life. She has a very difficult home life. We see Mukesh's personal circumstances. He's got 3 older daughters who have children of their own. We see how he discovers the love of reading, how that helps him to connect with his granddaughter, how that helps him to connect with Alicia, and how for the both of them reading allows them to sort of open up to each other and themselves, in terms of reflecting on some of the difficult stuff that is going on in their own lives. The story's interspersed as well with odd chapters by other sort of tangential characters who have, over the previous 2 years, discovered this same list of books in sort of odd circumstances. And so there's a bit of a mystery element in terms of where this list has originated from and who has been sort of leaving it around for people to discover. There are some really, quite serious issues discussed in here as well. But it's a really lovely book without being sickly sweet, and about the love of reading, how that helps you to connect with other people. There's a lot in here about libraries and the importance of libraries and the purpose that they serve for communities in so many ways. So yeah, this is a really lovely book to end the month on, and one I would highly recommend. So that's all the books that I read in February. Let me know down below what your favourite book that you read in February was. Let me know if you have any thoughts on this sort of vlog style type of wrap up. I think I'll probably do the same thing in March because it just feels a bit more manageable for me. But yeah, I hope you're all doing well, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.